Hello and welcome to the very first ESG Clarity Live. I'm Natalie Kenway, Global Head of ESG Insights for ESG Clarity, and today I'm joined by some of our industry experts and ESG Clarity Committee members. So today I have James Alexander, Chief Executive of the UK Sustainable Investment and Finance Association, and Julia Dreblow, Founding Director of SRS Services and Fund EcoMarket. Thank you both for coming in today. Great to have you for our first episode. I wanted to talk about some of the most pressing topics on the ESG agenda. We have at the moment an incredibly difficult investment landscape with the energy crisis, cost of living crisis, conflict in Ukraine, political turmoil in the UK. Sustainability has really sort of dropped down the agenda. There's less focus on it at this present time. But really these things could be all tackled together, isn't that right? What's your thoughts on that?
I mean, well, yeah, absolutely. It might have dropped down the politicians' agenda in terms of government, but what it certainly has not done is drop down the public agenda. You know, we've seen for a really long time, concerns about climate change, sustainability, more broadly, always ranking within the top 5 issues that general voters care about. And I think that's a really important thing to remember. And of course, this year we've seen, record-breaking temperatures in the UK. We've seen a third of Pakistan underwater. We've seen, ongoing wildfires and, crop failures. It's very clear that climate change is happening around us, and I think people are becoming more and more aware of this, and crucially expecting the government to step up. And we're in this situation where everybody needs to be doing everything that they can, and of course we need the government to be doing that, and that's why it's such a shame that we're so distracted by the political chaos that's unfolding around us, because we've got such enormous problems to face. And I think, as you said just a second ago, we have this long-term crisis of climate change which requires solutions to be, frankly, solutions needed to have been brought in place decades ago, but we're way behind already, and we can't just allow ourselves to be distracted by every single crisis, immediate crisis that comes along. And, it's absolutely right that we're focusing on Ukraine, we're focusing on cost of living crisis, but we've got to find solutions that can address all of these things. So, for example, we've got a crisis in terms of the amount of, about energy security and the amount of energy that we have. Surely one of the most obvious solutions to solving that is to reduce the amount of energy that we need to use. We've got some of the worst buildings in Europe in this country, but we do not have the stable regulatory environment that allows investors particularly to come in and support the development of the key industries that we're going to need, like energy efficiency.
Yeah. And Julia, what's your investors saying to you, what are your clients talking about in terms of all of these distractions going on?
Look, it's a crazy time. I mean, I spend my time with intermediaries broadly, and yes, what's happening in the world is deeply relevant. I mean, let's face it, asset values are way off where they were, so companies are now under a lot more pressure than they were. So things are changing, but you know what? People are still recruiting in this area. Things are still growing. The regulators growing their team in this area. The fund managers are growing their teams. Advisors are wondering what they're going to be doing and trying to position. Platforms are all very highly interested and highly engaged. So I think we really a few years ago reached, if you like, a tipping point in this area where it just hit public consciousness and people realised how important it was. And I don't think there's any real turning back from that. It's not going to grab the headlines in the same way, although I think a lot of us were very spooked by even the weather in this country this summer. It was too hot. It was too dry. So you don't have to be a genius or reading any IPCC reports or anything of the sort to realise that things aren't right, and I pretty much think people know that. So yes, we're being bombarded with all sorts of crazy things happening at the moment that 3-4 years ago we just didn't predict. But it would be utterly unforgivable to have something like climate change that has been predicted since the 60s, if we really fail. And I think people have understood that now. And I think, as I say, it's past that tipping point. I don't think there's any going back now.
Yeah.
And I think what's really exciting, building on what Julie said, is that large parts of the private sector now recognise they have a key role to play in this. We see, our members as financial services firms see their future as being sustainable. And I think this is a really key message that we need to give across to government, which, the government's saying, we must deregulate, we need to, to cut business regulation and all these things. That is not an agenda that businesses want. And if you speak to the CBI and others, they'll say the same from the real economy. And, that's certainly not the case from the, the financial service industry does not want a deregulated agenda. What we actually need is the stable regulatory environment that's predictable, that moves us all in the right direction, and that levels the playing field, so there isn't a first mover disadvantage. And I think that's so important that the government actually hears that message and recognises and realises that businesses want to be sustainable. We see this as part of our future. We see, our future competitiveness, which seems to be what this government, puts itself out there as trying to create a, competitive, growing economy. Well, actually, sustainable economy is a really key component of a competitive economy, and will be more and more so in the future.
Yeah, I think that's something I've heard quite a few times, is that ESG, or sustainable investing, is one of the only areas within financial services where the companies are saying we need more regulation, we need more guidance. And do you think we might perhaps have some of that coming out on COP27, or maybe more likely from the ISSB next year?
I think there's lots on the horizon, lots coming. Exactly when it will hit, with a lot of this stuff we don't know. We know the FCA is planning their SDR. We know ISSB is working towards international standards. There is going to be so much coming, and I think it will all take quite a while to actually work its way through the markets. But as people have understood the seriousness and started working on it, I would say really probably since about Paris Agreement time, I think over the last 5-6 years. So these big organisations have had time to think, okay, what do we really need? And start building the structures, putting in, if you like, the infrastructure that's needed in order to kind of really shore up the foundations to take us on to the next level. I don't think it's going to be all plain sailing. I think we've got to be pretty cautious of the fact that there are still people who don't get it.
Yes, absolutely.
But I think, building on James's comment, I think our current Prime Minister got the message loud and clear that we weren't prepared to throw away what we've been building for many years and just go all in on just ignoring environmental and other issues. So what happens on fracking will be an interesting one to watch. Yeah. But listen, this is all changing massively, and there are still people who don't get that we've signed up to Paris, let alone anything else. So there are people who will keep looking back in time and not recognising that we're moving forwards, and whether those people get left behind or retire, who knows, but the things really are changing, and there's a lot to come.
That was one of the exciting things from COP26 as well last year in Glasgow, when I think for me it felt like one of the first COPs where the private sector wasn't there to lobby for things to slow down or for governments to stop doing things, and you didn't get that great participation of the private sector in previous COPs. But in Glasgow, I think the amazing thing that the UK managed to do, and your full credit to the UK government for having done this, was this kind of race to zero, getting all these businesses to come together to not only kind of commit to net zero, to 2050 targets and other things, but also to call on the governments to do more, to get the kind of global governments to come together and say, right guys, we're the private sector of the world and we want you to do more, because we recognise that that's really important. And so we had the GFAN's commitment. I think half of the world's assets under management now making a net zero commitment. I think that what we need to see maybe at COP27 in Egypt is, what happens 1 year on from that, and what are the challenges of moving from where we are right now to all those assets being managed in a way that's net zero. And if you wanted to take half of the world's assets under management today and invest them into things that are net zero or net zero aligned, you wouldn't be able to do it. The stock of assets doesn't exist. And so I think what that says to me is that we can't just pretend, and government certainly cannot just pretend, don't worry, the private sector's got this, we don't need to make, we're government, we don't need to make hard decisions that make us unpopular because the private sector's made all these commitments and we're done. That is absolutely not going to work. Frankly, the situation is so serious, the timeline now so short, that every single player has to be doing everything they can, whether that's, as individuals, how the daily choices that we make, as companies as well, but then also governments must be creating that system where they can move together. And I think what's super interesting for government, I think, that doesn't necessarily grasp, is that not all of this costs money. And of course, we're in a situation, clearly, in the UK, where there's no money left. I think the new Chancellor made that very, very clear yesterday. Spending all this money on the energy guarantees, price guarantees, and all these sorts of things. Clearly, there is not vast amounts of public money to be throwing at this problem. sadly, just at a time when we could do with some public money to solve this problem. So what do we have to think about? We've got to look at other ways of making things happen through regulation. And what governments are able to do and able to create is the regulatory environment, the regulatory framework, whereby the private sector feels confident to do things itself. So, to give you an example, if you were the chief executive of a concrete company right now and you were thinking, well, one day I'm going to have to be net zero, but actually I don't have to be net zero today, and if I were, my products would be more expensive than they would be otherwise. So what's the best way for that to, every chief executive of every concrete company is thinking the same thing. So if we want to move the whole industry forward, what it requires is the government to say, okay guys, here's some warning, by such and such a date, maybe 5 years time, your concrete is required to be net zero if you want to sell it in this country. Fine. Playing field has been levelled. Everybody's concrete needs to be the same. Everybody will then find the investment to move forward to meet the regulation, and suddenly, hey presto, the government hasn't spent anything, but the concrete companies have all moved forward. The same can be applied to all sorts of different areas. And actually, if you look at, it's not all bad news actually. If you look at one area that has really worked, it's electric vehicle regulation. And why is that? Because everybody has faith and believes that what the government says about electric vehicles not being, the only type of car you can buy from 2030 onwards being electric, everyone believes that that's true. So nobody has any concerns about investing in the future of electric plug-ins and other infrastructure that you need for electrification of vehicles. Why can't we do the same for other areas? Yeah. That's the key.
And I think the government now has got the message at COP26 that there's not going to be massive pushback from business. Yes. We know clearly there are some industries where there are many people who have very strong financial incentives to not allow the status quo to be changed. However, broadly speaking, governments now know that they have the backing of industry when they make brave decisions in a way that they didn't prior to COP26. And if we need anything to come out of COP27, it's shoring up that kind of thing, where you get government and industry working together. And not only to say to people, we've got to find all this new money to do things, it's about reallocating existing capital.
Yes.
So, for example, all those investment companies that are launching a new fund which is going to be Paris aligned, not good enough. All of your assets need to be Paris aligned. And that kind of message needs to get through. Yes, of course, any fund is welcome, but it's the fact that everything needs to shift.
I think investors are going to be asking that of providers soon as well. It's not just about the one or two funds that they've got. It needs to be seen across the range.
It's long overdue. I mean, it always had to apply to all assets. I was saying that kind of thing 20 years ago and writing papers on that kind of thing, because you know that otherwise you're just playing around the margins. And it's really important that we have a leading edge. So there's always going to be that marginal area where these are the innovators. But if I always say, if you can invest as much as you like in wind farms, but if we're still pulling as much coal, oil and gas out of the ground as we were, then those wind turbines make no difference. You've just got a load of metal stuff on the sides, in addition to all these carbon emissions. So we've got to reallocate, and I think we touched on it a little bit earlier, talking about the fact that oil companies, their investments are not currently going into green infrastructure. They're still going into digging more oil out of the ground. So those are the kinds of things that they've got to get a very clear message from governments, from COP, from the like, to explain that is no longer acceptable. They really must move.
And that one of the biggest tragedies, I think, since the Paris Agreement was signed is that there's been over $4 trillion of lending to new fossil fuel infrastructure since the Paris Agreement. This is insanity, and I think and it's not only completely insane from a kind of stranded assets perspective, but it also potentially runs the risk that those assets can't be stranded because they're systemically too important to the financial system. And I think we've got to be really, really careful and start looking very closely at how it is that banks are lending to new fossil fuel assets and the kind of risk weighting that they're applying to those investments. I think it's a really big challenge. And at the same time, we've now got to also start thinking about what are the financial models that can allow us to shut stuff down, in a responsible and socially responsible way. There's two ways to have this transition. There's the orderly transition where people's jobs and livelihoods and communities are protected and supported, and there's the disorderly transition where that doesn't happen and where it becomes very hard for a lot of people. And we saw, of course, like we saw when the coal mines were closed in this country in the 80s, that was a very disorderly transition, and a lot of the parts of the country is still paying the price of that. How can we make sure that doesn't happen without stopping the core agenda, which is to actually make all this activity stop in the first place? There's an awful lot of thinking still to be done, but
But those are questions questions that all investors can ask. So if you're an
Really?
individual
Yes.
investor, you ask your intermediaries. You're an intermediary, you ask your
Right.
platforms or portfolio provider. If you're a portfolio provider, you ask your asset manager, asset owners, and you push it back on up the chain. So I work with a well-known DFM, Parmenian, so they've got a lot of money under management in this area, and that's one of the questions we put into their questionnaire recently. So they're asking everybody. So when we go out and review companies, what are you doing about banks financing fossil fuels?
Yeah.
Everybody in this industry, because we've all got skin in the game. If you've got investments or are involved in the investment industry, these things matter because they can topple. Well, they can topple pretty much every industry
Yeah,
if it goes wrong enough. So they make it known that these are on your agenda. And use whatever power you've got, whether it be as an individual or a big organisation, to at least ask the questions and get people to recognise the future risks and start taking action in an orderly fashion, as James says.
Okay, some fantastic points there. I do want to move on to the next question. So one of the biggest pieces of UK regulation for sustainability is expected to come out before the end of the month, the sustainability disclosure requirements. I do have to check the words behind the acronym sometimes. So SDR. And so we understand that the FCA is looking at some buckets for different fund labels. What do you think would be most helpful for investors?
I personally think they're going down the right route.
Okay.
Look, I'm biased. I've been involved, as has James, but I've also run Fund EcoMarket, our database that's done something very, very similar for the last 12 years, and we know people find it really useful. So you need buckets which use really easy to understand words that anybody, be it a financial advisor, financial planner who's new to the area, or someone who's maybe just got £3,000 to put in an ISA, can understand broadly what that word means. Mm-hmm. So that's your label. Mm-hmm. And then underneath that, access to as much information as they might need to fully explain what it is a fund actually does. Mm-hmm. Because at the moment, you've got massively different levels of disclosure. Some people's idea of disclosure is to throw a whole load of numbers at people, all of which can be taken out of context and when looked at by a regular individual investor mean absolutely nothing to them. Is 4 stars better than 1 star?
Yes.
It depends what the question is. It depends what you're interested in.
Yeah, there are
people
so
don't
many different
understand
things that people don't understand. Like we've been talking about Paris-aligned benchmarks and things, but consumers would not understand immediately what that would imply.
And that's one of the really exciting things the FCA has done that I think is really positive. The FCA is looking at this from a consumer protection angle. They have an additional duty which they were given last year to also take account of the UK's net zero targets, and I think that's a really important duty that they have. But they're not looking at it from that lens. They're looking at this from the lens of protecting consumers. And the FCA's letter that they sent to chairs of pension funds about a year ago basically said that they're concerned about a risk of mis-selling in this market. And I think that shows you they're looking at this from a consumer protection angle. They are thinking about, there are people out there that are, whether they're individual investors, whether it's pension fund holders, whether it's institutional investors, that are buying funds that have got, nice snazzy brochures with pictures of solar panels and polar bears and ice caps and all these things in them. And the FCA, rightly, is concerned that there's a huge amount of mis-selling, and what that's doing is it's bringing the whole industry potentially into disrepute, meaning that people do not trust what they're seeing and what they're reading. And I think the most important thing here is that we can use this process, the SDR framework, with regulated fund labels, so you can only say you're sustainable if you're genuinely doing something that relates to that, is going to bring that confidence and that trust back to the industry. And the FCA has done a huge amount of consumer testing, to Julia's earlier point, about what do these different labels actually mean? What does a general person on the street think about when they're told, do you want to invest responsibly? Do you want to invest sustainably? Do you believe in stewardship? Do these words mean anything? What do they mean? And I think the consumer testing piece is so important to get that moving forward. And what we're about to see is a huge consultation. We're expecting great interest from the industry in responding to this consultation, but what's really positive is the FCA has also involved the industry in the whole development of this process. That's why we've been involved, and lots of other industry bodies, and that's been so important to get these things right, because we need them to be right. The UK is a little bit late to the party on this. The EU's been doing a lot of work for a number of years. They've made some mistakes in that process, and we want to learn from them. We want to make sure that first time round we get this right, and that this is a world-leading regulatory framework. Yeah,
and Julia, when we were chatting before, you said we shouldn't be so hard on the FCA. We've had a few delays with this piece of legislation, this consultation. So, We think we should be a bit more sympathetic.
Yeah, so I mean, I've had involvement with the FCA or regulators, I should say, on and off for a number of years, and previous incarnations, if you like, FSA, just wouldn't talk about this area. They said it was too granular and had nothing to do with investment. I mean, just a million miles away from where we are today. And they completely didn't get it. I wish to goodness they had, because we'd be in a better place now. However, they didn't. So they've gone out doing consumer testing. They've been talking to members of the industry. They're listening to the concerns and the problems people are having who are new to the area. And they're learning from people who've got a lot of experience in the area. And they're bringing this all together, and they're smart, and they've been upskilling, and they've kept the dialogue going. The FCA doesn't always get a great press, but in this, honestly, they've been really, really good, and everyone has been saying hats off to them. Actually, they're doing the right things here. They're bringing it all together. They're learning, and I've not heard anyone say a bad word against them. And I hope to goodness the paper is what we expect, and I'm sure it will be, along the lines of what we're expecting. Some very plain English buckets and a load of explanation, and that's basically what people need to be able to make the right decision, because they're there as a regulator for consumer protection. That's their core role. So if you look at all the other regulation that sits on the retail side, if you're talking prod, consumer duty, know your client, all that, going back years and years, people are meant to know what their clients want. And somehow or another, people have been refusing for years that somehow or another your personal values and the things you care about, like, I don't want the ice caps melt. David Attenborough the other day talking about sea level rises of 7 metres, for goodness sake. That's most of the big cities that are anywhere near a coast, gone. Most of us don't actually want that. No. So of course we should bring it in. So we'll have bits of regulation like the SDR, the consultation will come out, will most likely end up being regulation sometime mid-year next year, I would imagine. And then building it into everything else that goes on, just to make it a little bit more obvious that this is actually part of what meeting clients' needs are all about. Okay. So it's a question of how we stitch it all together going forwards, but my feeling is that they'll do a good job of that. They're asking the right questions.
Yeah. Well, thank you both. That's all we've got time for. Thank you so much for your insights. I knew it would be a great first episode, so thank you.
Pleasure.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.